Hi, my name is Michelle Jenkins, and today I will be presenting a talk on post-traumatic growth in African American clergy for trauma 810, adult and familial trauma. So these are the topics that we will be discussing during this talk. And some of those things that we will talk about is just understanding post-traumatic growth and how um, it works with secondary trauma. Uh, prevalence and relevance of studying this population, theoretical framework, the stigma that's tied to mental health within the African American community. We'll integrate some biblical content and discuss some implications for ministry and mental health practice, and some future research directions and conclusions. So post-traumatic growth is essential for clergy because pastors in African American churches often listen to church members share their difficult experiences like grief and a loss of a loved one. For example, the loss of church members and the losses of loved ones experienced by church members during the pandemic are no exception. In fact, I witnessed it at my own church during COVID-19. There were homegoing services nearly every month for a while, and most of the services were preached by our pastor, and who also knew all of those who had transitioned and had known them for several decades. This can be difficult for clergy and church leaders and anxiety inducing and lead to secondary trauma. At the same time, research on post-traumatic growth indicates that pastors can find new strength, deeper faith, and closer relationships after going through traumatic struggles. Studying post-traumatic growth in pastors can show how their faith and role in the church help them turn pain into personal growth and better ministry. So, to distinguish between trauma and post-traumatic growth, trauma is a negative response to a traumatic event, a crisis, or danger, while post-traumatic growth takes place after the traumatic event as the person struggles with the impact of the trauma. As the person works through the trauma, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral changes can lead to self-growth, and this is indicated by new values and a changed attitude about life and life's issues. Post-traumatic growth does not occur as a result of trauma, but happens as the brain strives to make sense of the trauma in a way that brings meaning and value from the traumatic event. It is also necessary to distinguish between post-traumatic growth and resilience. Resilience, or the ability to bounce back, is a skill that exists within a person before a traumatic event, a crisis, or a dangerous situation takes place. So it's already within the individual. It's reflected in their self-identity, their self-image, including one's sense of purpose, ability to influence, and how they engage with the other issues of life leading up to the traumatic event. The greater one's self-esteem, the more empowered one feels, the stronger their resilience in the face of trauma. On the other hand, post-traumatic growth, or bouncing forward, occurs through cognitive processing of a trauma using personal strength, the ability to interact and relate to others, and the ability to remain thankful and look towards a positive future. So these are just some reminders of direct and the definitions within the DSM-5 of direct trauma and indirect trauma, and that the clergy experience both types. Of course, direct trauma is that trauma that is personally experienced. Indirect trauma, it comes in two forms. Either one witnesses a traumatic event that affects someone else, or one is told of a traumatic event or accidental or violent death of someone that they know. So there are a couple of different types of indirect traumas, and one of those is vicarious trauma, which occurs after the in this case the clergy or a professional helper is repeatedly exposed to the trauma stories and other pain narratives while helping their congregant or someone else. Their pain starts to gradually, subtly over time affect and change how the clergy helper sees themselves, sees the others around them, and the world. And these things can impact one's mental and emotional well-being. The other type of indirect, other type of indirect trauma is burnout, which occurs when ongoing work stress is ignored or handled improperly, and this leaves the clergy feeling drained, empty, depressed, guilty, and ineffective in ministry. And they will also tend to withdraw from their congregation. Finally, secondary trauma is while vicarious trauma is a gradual onset of symptoms, secondary trauma is a rapid onset of onset. Secondary trauma is the result of clergy experiencing emotional pain due to helping others through their trauma. It's common in professions that involve deep empathic engagement. African American clergy, who often serve as first responders in their communities, are especially vulnerable to secondary trauma. Burnout, on the other hand, develops gradually due to chronic stress, role overload, and emotional exhaustion. Although the two conditions overlap, secondary trauma stems from trauma exposure, while burnout arises from ongoing occupational stress. Those consequences can include compassion, fatigue, it can include compassion fatigue, reduced empathy, and even withdrawal from ministry. However, protective factors like peer support, personal boundaries, sabbaticals, and spiritual disciplines have been shown to mitigate these effects. Supportive faith community and culturally responsive self-care practices are essential for clergy resilience and post-traumatic growth. So here's a chart that distinguishes between secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and burnout. As you can see, a lot of the symptoms can overlap between secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and burnout, but the highlighted text are the differences between what distinguishes each trauma from the other. For instance, in secondary trauma, one may experience compassion fatigue, but in that same line, vicarious trauma, there's a gradual change in their feelings and their thinking about themselves, the people around them, and the world. And in burnout, they just become ineffective in ministry because they are exhausted. Another difference across the board is secondary trauma. One may experience intrusion, while vicarious trauma, that person would in that same instance would just appear to be unmotivated, and in burnout, that person would still be tasked to do the work and still try to do the work, but is feeling overwhelmed. And finally, secondary trauma can present as numbness. You just have no feelings at all, or appear to have no feelings at all. You are not very responsive. But vicarious trauma, that same situation, you would feel very vulnerable. And burnout, you just would not get any sleep. Post-traumatic growth is essential for ministry as there are positive outcomes associated with helping and caring. Post-traumatic growth could reduce the onset of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, or burnout. For example, post-traumatic growth can increase empathy and compassion satisfaction. As we saw in the last slide, a trait of secondary trauma is numbness. Post-traumatic growth would minimize the risk of numbness taking place. One study stated that rather than clergy experiencing compassion fatigue, many of them often experience compassion satisfaction. Post-traumatic growth also leads to personal growth and resilience. There may also be spiritual benefits. For example, none of the clergy studied in the Benton and Girdley 2023 study said that their faith or fellowship with God was compromised. Post-traumatic growth can also increase relational bonds. Benton and Girdley in 2023 reported that clergy reported being closer and more in tune with their families. So the population of interest is the African American clergy, and we're specifically targeting the urban churches in Baltimore, Maryland. Both male and female clergy members, they're married, typically 25 years and older. A minimum of a GED or high school diploma, 5 years or more in ministry, and this would also include denominational and non-denominational Christian churches, Christian pastors, assistant ministers, chaplains, and community faith leaders in predominantly African American congregations. The pastoral, amongst this population, the pastoral stress burdens there are a few of them. African American clergy are often, as we said earlier, first responders to a crisis, or the first person the community and church members call during personal crisis. So their stress burden includes emotional strain or unrealistic expectations, great demands by their church members, which can ultimately lead to burnout. The historical role of the Black church has always been a place of refuge. Pew Research Center reports that the African American church, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries, has historically provided spiritual and social support for African Americans. For African Americans, the church is considered, as we said, a place of refuge. It's often referred to as the hospital. It's a place where one can freely and outwardly not only express their Christian faith, but honor and maintain their African American traditions. It's also the first place where African Americans found respect and clout. Um, and began to serve as spokesmen and leaders and advocates for their community. The church was also a means for the community to gain skills and learn to read, offering job training and financial help. So some of the other stresses include African Americans are, as we said earlier, are often the first responders to crisis within their community, and their stress burden can go on include feeling like they must be a superhero. They have to be perfect. They have to fix and right every wrong of their church members, and this can increase their stress level. They tend to work long hours and wear many, many hats. And are exposed to the unrealistic expectations of their church members. That is to say, clergy should always be the church members often believe that clergy should always be available and unaffected by their own personal trials. There are a few post-traumatic growth studies, very few post-traumatic growth studies on African American clergy or comparison of clergy by denomination. Because of the essential role of African American clergy within their communities, it's essential to fully understand the spiritual, social, and clinical resources that can be helpful for them to move from trauma to post-traumatic growth and reduce impairment, because there's also very little in the literature on providing support for clergy in the way of training and education. Clark et al. In 2021 reported that it's also necessary to understand how one-on-one emotional, spiritual, and mental health training could impact their effectiveness in ministry. Secondary trauma arises from helping others in distress. However, there's little empirical data on the prevalence of secondary traumatic stress in African American clergy. And this is one of the things that will need to be studied in order to also draw some conclusions and study post-traumatic growth. While empirical findings on post-traumatic growth and African American clergy are lacking, clergy support others through trauma, making them vulnerable to secondary trauma, which requires us to understand post-traumatic growth and how to better train, educate, and prepare clergy for trauma. According to Pastoral Care Incorporated, some 2025 statistics show that 75% of pastors report significant stress-related crisis at least once in their ministry. 66% of churches have no lay counseling support. 57% of pastors feel discouraged, stressed, and fatigued. 35% of pastors battle depression or fear of inadequacy. 28% of pastors report having feelings of guilt for taking personal time off and not telling the church, and 27% of pastors report not having anyone to turn to for help in a crisis situation. So while we don't have a lot of information on the prevalence and severity of secondary trauma within the African American clergies, we can draw some conclusions from other professional helpers. For instance, emergency room nurses. If we look at emergency room nurses, 65% of emergency room nurses in the U.S. reported experiencing secondary trauma in a single year. 74% of emergency room nurses in Asia reported experiencing secondary trauma. Um, Other professional helpers during COVID-19's lockdown, India globally reported 88% of doctors and 79% of nurses experienced varying degrees of secondary trauma, which indicated the pandemic's severe effects on the mental well-being of healthcare professionals. The COVID-19 pandemic increased secondary trauma among urban helpers. And while they are not listed and there is no data on them, we would assume, because of the position that African American clergy have within their communities, that these numbers would somehow be a reflection of the numbers of them as well. But 26% of social workers in the United States during the pandemic met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and 50% of social workers reported moderate to high levels of secondary trauma. So, based off of clergy interviews, uh, uh, the interviews revealed that clergy experience greater stress than professional counselors, teachers, and healthcare workers. And the main reason, reported by Molnar et al., 2021 and Adams et al. 2017 is because of they have unclear boundaries. Unclear boundaries, difficulty maintaining boundaries can increase the emotional impact. So in comparison to all of the statistics we just reviewed on professional healthcare workers enduring traumatic events, clergy experience greater stress than any of the other professions. Whether this is due to a lack of professional training and education that the other health professions are given is unknown. However, Molnar et al. Did state that training in emotional regulation is needed to reduce excessive empathy being used by professional trainers. The writers stated that absent training, professional helpers are at a greater risk of vicarious trauma. So this is the Tedeschi and Calhoun post-traumatic growth process, and the diagram is recreated from a journal article by Henson et al. In 2020. Tedeschi and Calhoun also created a 21-item inventory to assess the presence and intensity of post-traumatic growth. As post-traumatic growth considers the positive impact that can result after experiencing trauma and self-growth, their model also considers the ability to establish stable, functional relationships as a result of learning more tolerance and patience, sensitivity and compassion, psychological resilience, confidence, and self-control. And so these traits foster resilience and change in values. And so as we look at the PTG model, it starts with the person pre-trauma, and this would include who they are and their and how resilient they are in the cares and wears of the world up to the point of the traumatic event. And so that is the person that will pursue this post-traumatic growth. And so then you have the traumatic event, and it's usually an event that is not controlled by the victim. It's unexpected, and it's dangerous. It's a crisis situation, and that person then moves into an area of confusion. They're shattered, where their whole thought, beliefs prior to the traumatic event are now challenged and even shattered, and all their thoughts and everything about the world. And so then that moves into cognitive engagement, and that person then considers two domains. One, what did the traumatic event overall, what's the overall meaning of the traumatic event? What can they take away from it? And then two, how does the traumatic event, how does that directly impact them? What can they learn from it? How can they grow from it? Um, Individual cognitive processing then takes place, and this is done through disclosure, talking about what happened, how they feel, and expressing themselves, being transparent. It also includes having a support group, having a network of people around them, as accountability and checks and balances, and then narrative, also telling their story. Individuals during this cognitive processing time, they reconsider the basic assumptions about their own self, their personal identity, and then the world around them, and the future. After that, there's a reframing. They move from feeling confused and shattered, and they begin to reframe their lives, to take on to include the lessons that they have engaged and processed, and so that then derives into new perspectives, new beliefs, new life, and new goals. And from there is spiritual and there is spiritual and individual growth. The independent variables for post-traumatic growth include African American clergy, exposure to indirect trauma from either unprofessional counseling or helping their traumatized church members. Alessi and Kahn 2023 reference the secondary traumatic stress scale to assess secondary trauma. Another independent variable is coping strategies that could be positive. For example, prayer or meaning making, or negative um, coping strategies like beginning to use substances. Another independent variable is spiritual resilience and how one's faith may promote meaning making and increase resilience. The last independent variable is the mental health stigma, which still exists within the walls of the church and the community in this 21st century. Because of this, clergy are less likely to seek counseling or disclose personal emotional struggles. The dependent variable is post-traumatic growth, and the positive psychological changes associated with post-traumatic growth um, including increased appreciation for life, improved relationships, new hope, new horizons, increased strength and resilience, and spiritual growth. Some mediating or moderating variables include meaning making or the positive reframing of suffering, burnout, or compassion fatigue, which can not only impair African American clergy, but could also reduce the positive outcomes associated with post traumatic growth. Other mediating or moderating variables are the demographic factors like age, denomination, and education, which can impact trauma exposure and post traumatic growth outcome. Mental health stigma prevents many clergy from seeking care. Tagba et al. In 2022 said that one way to reduce mental illness stigma and change attitudes regarding counseling is to educate and train clergy through mental health training. Studies indicate that clergy presence and buy-in to mental health can not only improve their own mental health, but their church members' mental health as well. Clergy suffer in silence as a result of the stigma attached to mental health. Mental health clergy specific stigma also prevents many clergy from seeking mental health support because they are afraid that their admission of distress will translate to others as weakness, faithlessness, spiritual failure, or ministerial incompetence. A member of clergy who admits to being depressed or anxious may be viewed as incompetent. Clark et al. 2021 noted that oftentimes mental slash emotional disorders amongst clerics are considered a personal choice that the clergy should just get over it. And so what happens as a result of not being able to be forthcoming about um, their struggles, their mental health struggles, clergy replace transparency with deep acting or surface acting. Surface acting means putting on a certain expression or emotion to match what is expected in a situation, even when it doesn't match what's going on internally within the individual. An example of surface acting is a cashier who smiles and remains cheerful with an obnoxious customer while internally they really feel annoyed. Deep acting means genuinely changing how you feel inside so your emotions match what's expected in a situation. An example of deep acting is a similar scenario is that cashier would make a sincere effort to genuinely feel empathy towards the rude customer or focus on other positive aspects of their job. So the stigma of clinical counseling, African Americans are much less likely than white Americans to get mental health support. They are only about half as likely to see a therapist. They are more likely to stop therapy early, and they are 3 times more likely not to start therapy at all. And all of these are taken from Rogenbaum et al. 2023. African American clergy not only experience secondary trauma while supporting their traumatized congregants, they also are affected by personal, direct trauma such as racial discrimination. They report that the most influential coping mechanism is their faith, which they also said helps to meaning make, thus promoting post traumatic growth. However, cultural and community unreasonable expectations to always be strong, available, and spiritually grounded can increase the negative impact of secondary traumatic stress. Understanding the correlation between race, faith, and trauma can be integral in performing trauma-informed care and promoting post-traumatic growth. The role of worship and prayer is one, a source of strength and healing, offering emotional and spiritual restoration amid trauma. It's a means of emotional expression, as worship offers a culturally safe place to express pain and sorrow, hope and resilience, and it's a source of protection. Research has correlated prayer and worship with increased mental well-being and reduced stress. Faith and cultural identity strengthen resilience. In the book of Job, from chapters 1 to 42, Job remained steadfast despite immense loss, physical pain, minimal social support, and empathy and suffering. Job shows faith under trial, and God blesses him in the end for his faithfulness. The story of Job could be linked to meaning making through trust and perseverance. The Apostle Paul endured imprisonment, persecution, and hardship, writing and also wrote 13 of the New Testament books while imprisoned. Paul found strength through faith. For when I am weak, he said, then I am strong. King David, um, uh, I'm sorry, the Apostle Paul transformed his suffering into ministry and spiritual growth. King David shows resilience through emotional transparency. Through his Psalms, where he expresses all of his emotions from sorrow, anger, fear, and praise, we can see how God cares about everything concerning us. He wants our truth, which leads to his healing and renewal. Faith and cultural identity strengthen resilience. Resilience is a protective factor acting as a psychological shield, reducing the long-term effects of trauma. Resilience is impacted by optimism and meaning-making, prayer, scripture reading, reflection, worship, and social support, like family, community, and faith-based institutions. Resilience is also connected to one's faith. As we discussed with Job, Apostle Paul, and King David, ultimately, spiritual resilience increases our trust in God and his divine purpose and increases hope. Resilience can promote post-traumatic growth, leading to deeper faith, wisdom, and empathy. Some biblical examples of growth through suffering. The first one is in Romans 5, 3, and 5, which tells us that we should glory or rejoice in our confidence and trust in God because there's purpose in the trial. Suffering can produce hope, character, and spiritual growth. Likewise, in James chapter 1, 2, and 4, we are encouraged to remain joyful when we are beset with issues and circumstances because, again, there's purpose in the trial. Our faith will produce patience, and that patience, the ability to remain steadfast, unmovable, committed, and faithful, will ensure we are ultimately fully complete in the end, lacking nothing when it's over. Spiritual transformation parallels post-traumatic growth having shared outcomes. Specifically, both involve growth through suffering and meaning, um, making making in adversity. Both spiritual transformation and post traumatic growth result in changed perspectives, priorities, and relationships with self, others, and God. Spiritual transformation can lead to a closer, deeper relationship and connection with God as a result of trials or suffering. It leads to humility and surrender, a deeper faith connection, and a new sense of purpose. The final outcome is that post traumatic growth and spiritual transformation yield hope, compassion, and wisdom. Pain turns into purpose. Post traumatic growth emphasizes personal strength, appreciation for life, and new possibilities, while spiritual transformation emphasizes renewal of faith, forgiveness, and divine purpose. Job and Paul show us that faith integration produces spiritual growth through suffering, not after it's over. In other words, the growth that comes from it is as you walk through the pain. Therefore, trauma is an avenue leading to spiritual maturity. Holistic professional counseling should include not only scientific methods, but spiritual principles when possible. True healing is holistic, touching mind, body, and spirit. Just as loving God requires all of us, mind, body, and spirit, Luke 10:27 tells us that we're to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength. We should also pursue healing that impacts the whole person. Scripture also exhorts us to present our bodies to God and renew our minds in Romans 12. Some spiritual disciplines that can be integrated into healing are prayer, forgiveness, and worship. These acts can lead to meaning making and hope. Integrating psychological insight into holistic healing involves evidence based therapy that impacts cognitive, emotional, and behavioral change. Some of the techniques used to achieve this would be mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy. The main post-traumatic growth can predict resilience, but resilience does not necessarily lead to post-traumatic growth, and that's a line from Lee et al. In 2025. The main traits of post-traumatic growth, once again, are changes in perception and insight, empathy and compassion towards others, life appreciation, peace, and acceptance. Acts that can help to promote post-traumatic growth include transparency or being honest about one's feelings, cognitive processing of the traumatic event, which is part of the Tedeschi Calhoun post-traumatic growth model, um, positive coping methods that include staying optimistic and increasing spiritually and resilience. These implications, trauma-informed ministry, clergy self-care, or these interventions, trauma-informed ministry, clergy self-care and boundaries, training and collaboration, um, are essential for clergy and those serving in ministry. Leaders need to understand the emotional cost of pastoral work and have access to supportive resources. Integrating mental health strategies with theology allows for holistic healing, addressing the mind, body, and spirit. Furthermore, cultural and faith-based nuances, especially within African American congregations, should guide practice. By blending professional counseling methods with spiritual formation, clergy can model resilience, reduce stigma, and foster healthier, more supportive church environments. There's limited research targeting African American clergy and post-traumatic growth. More studies are needed to understand what promotes post-traumatic growth after clergy experience secondary trauma. Additionally, more culturally sensitive studies would help to provide support to further eliminate the mental health stigma and recognize the symptoms of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, and burnout, and prevent clergy impairment. Secondary trauma is real among African American clergy. They frequently are exposed to their parishioners' pain, which can lead to emotional fatigue, burnout, and spiritual strain, but can also promote post traumatic growth and resilience. Ways to promote holistic healing and perhaps reduce the stigma associated with mental health is through the integration of theology with psychological principles. Additionally, post traumatic growth may be a more regular outcome of trauma exposure when clergy adopt self-care as an essential part of ministry. Just as Jesus took time out for prayer and refreshing and isolated himself to be with God, clergy must do the same by setting boundaries and seeking accountability and professional counseling. In the end, the path forward should include consistent, culturally sensitive training and collaboration between clergy and mental health professionals.